I suppose this is in part related to my last video, but it can also be related to a lot of videos that I've made on the subject of gender issues throughout my YouTube experience. I'm thinking about which angle to take this video because I want to talk a little bit about my perspective on the issue of men's rights and its place today. It is indisputable that feminism as a movement has got a lot more focus traditionally than the men's rights movement. There is no question about that. Now some would argue that is because traditionally the patriarchy controlled women in a way that it didn't control men. I do dispute the claim of male privilege in history. I believe I made 1 or 2 videos about that specifically. But there has been focus, I think, because in certain types of legislation, let's be honest about it, did discriminate against women. It is simply a fact that women could not vote when men could, and there were issues about that. So the issue of enfranchisement was something that negatively impacted women traditionally. So I think that's why the early feminist movement obviously got a lot of attention, the suffragette actions and so on. And then throughout the 20th century you had different waves, and then what we have today is this third wave feminism, which is very controversial, and in my opinion with good reason. I won't unsay anything I've said about feminism because I think it's legitimate criticism. I've never called myself anti-feminist because I am not against all women's rights movements. I'm not against all specific women's movements. I think there are parts of the world where there's specifically grave problems going on and a specific women's campaign is needed. So if that's feminism, then I'm not opposed to all feminism. And I'm certainly not opposed to the original concept of feminism, which was a genuine egalitarian concept, although there were hypocrisies in the way some of that went about. But it is obvious that the men's rights movement has been hugely overlooked. Now, I don't describe myself as a masculist either. I'm not an anti-feminist, I'm not a feminist, but neither do I call myself a masculist. The reason I don't is in part because I think as soon as you start to pigeonhole yourself with an ideology, it's a little bit like chaining yourself to a political party. You kind of have to go with the flow, and you're pigeonholed to it. You know, a lot of feminists complain about the negative image that feminism has, and they'll say things like, oh, but we don't hate men, we're just about equality and so on. And for the record, I actually do believe that a lot of feminists are decent people who don't hate men and who probably do have the right intentions, but nevertheless I believe the movement is deeply, deeply flawed. So likewise, I think if I was to call myself a masculist, it would then pigeonhole me into something that does get misinterpreted quite a lot. And sometimes, like every movement, there are people within the movement who don't exactly help give it a good image. The fact of the matter is that whilst, I mean, one of the ways that masculism or the men's rights movement is viewed is as a sort of backlash to feminism, and I think feminists see it as, oh, these are bitter men who don't like the fact that women are standing up for their rights, so they're making this false analogy that they have a victimhood mentality, except that it's not a false analogy. There is a lot of legitimate concerns that men have. So I think it's automatically categorized as a backlash to feminism. I think it partly is a backlash to feminism, like sort of the view that, okay, wait a minute, you women are demanding that you get equal rights, but actually look at men's issues. We are disproportionately suffer in many ways as well. So personally, I regard the men's movement as not opposition to women's rights, but simply trying to highlight men's issues that are far too often overlooked. Now, I think the reason that the men's rights movement has probably not got as much attention in the mainstream media as it should do, and certainly far less than feminism has, is because there are men within the men's rights movement who basically do have misogynistic attitudes. Just like I think not every feminist hates men, certainly not every masculist hates women, but it's indisputable that there are misogynists within the movement. I've been on men's rights pages online that on the surface have good intentions. They're trying to raise issues about men's rights, but then you look at some of the comments and there are basically misogynistic comments about hating women and just cheap jokes that really aren't that funny, and some things that, so that's in part something that puts me off the men's rights movement, the fact that there are misogynists in their midst, just as there are misandrists in feminism, and neither movement really takes its extremists that seriously, and they should. Also, I don't want to become a masculist, because that would give I think another perception is that if you believe in men's rights or you call yourself a masculist, this is a perception that you are against women's rights or you ignore women's rights. I don't think that is the case. I think it's not the case that men's rights activists don't care about women's rights or they're trying to stand in the way of women's rights. It's more that they feel aggrieved that men's issues are overlooked. However, there are some MRAs that again give the movement a bad image by pretending that everything is perfect for women, because they're so obsessed in their opposition to feminism that they ignore the fact that there are issues impacting women. Even in societies, I believe, where legislation is equal, it would be wrong to say that everything is perfect for women. That's not true. I mean, if you look at the shamefully low conviction rate for rape, that's something that arguably lets down women. Now, in the last video I was talking about legislation that lets down men, and it does. But what I want to get at is there needs to be some sort of neutral movement that really, genuinely pushes egalitarianism for both men and women. And the first way to do that is to recognise that both men and women have issues that impact them. Now, the problem both the feminist movement and the MRA movement has made is by claiming exclusive victimhood. Feminists continuously promote the lie about male privilege. Now, individual feminists may say, oh, we know there are men's issues, we're not ignoring those, but actually the movement is. And by promoting the false narrative of male privilege, that is directly stirring up hostility to half the human race by giving the impression that all men are privileged. And that's something the feminist movement constantly does. They can deny it as much as they want, but by promoting the logic of male privilege, they encourage women to constantly feel like victims, which is actually very patronising to women, but it also builds resentment against men. And I don't actually think that it's that different from far-right groups trying to make maybe poor white people feel aggrieved that they are somehow being taken over by immigrants and so on. It's pretty much the same concept. It's just that feminism is obviously accepted by the media. But what the MRA movement does, and this is one reason why I will not fully endorse it, is that they then claim that because their anger is understandable. I feel angry as a fellow man. I feel angry that men's issues are continuously overlooked, and feminists are partly to blame for that, because they push the legislation that is biased in favour of women, and they shout down men's rights activists when they do try to raise these concerns. So they are partly responsible. However, the MRA movement, for its part, also needs to accept that things are not perfect for women either, and to say that it is misleading. So both movements, in my opinion, are guilty of claiming exclusive victimhood. I think feminism is more guilty of that, but the MRA movement is starting to do it as well. And this is not to say that both movements will say that their extremists shouldn't be allowed to speak for them, but they have a responsibility to rein in on the extremists, those who are stirring up hatred against men or women. Because the fact of the matter is, both groups have a lot of legitimate concerns. I've been very, very critical of feminism, but I don't want to be pigeonholed immediately as a masculist or an MRA. For one thing, unlike a lot of masculists, I am not hostile to women. I love women. I'm not just saying that as a sort of womanizing statement. I like women. I like being around women. I generally have positive feelings towards women. And I'm sure a lot of MRAs do. But they need to really rein in those guys who are making the MRA movement look bad. I mean, I've heard some ridiculous statements like feminism has been responsible for all the West's failings. Now that is ridiculous. That is utterly ridiculous. Also, being opposed to the hypocrisy of feminism doesn't mean that you can't acknowledge some of the problems that motivated it as a movement in the first place. I mean, patriarchy didn't just impact women, it impacted men as well. Where the feminist movement is wrong is to ignore male sacrifice, which they always do. They promote the false narrative of male privilege, but they ignore the fact that, I mean, I've heard feminists say, oh, but men should support feminism because patriarchy hurt men. And yet, at the same time, they ignore the fact that it was feminists who promoted the White Feather campaign that shamed men in the First World War, literally driving them to their deaths. Now, to be fair, the feminist movement was divided at that time. There were pacifist feminists who didn't want to see their brothers and fathers killed, and who did, to their credit, they did speak out against it. But Emmeline Pankhurst, probably the most famous feminist in history, was enthusiastically for that campaign. And I've seen very little criticism from feminists of her that she sent lots of men to their deaths. Men to their deaths. Because let's just be clear about this notion of male privilege. It doesn't exist. It's a false narrative. You see, this is what I resent. Feminists will look at something like the government or major business positions and say, oh, well, look, it's all dominated by men. That proves our victimhood mentality. But they ignore the fact that the people at the very bottom are also overwhelmingly men. I'm referring to the homeless. It's not to say that it's exclusively men. There are women who are homeless as well, and homeless is horrible for anybody. But it is quite obvious that this is an issue that impacts men more. So why is there not a debate in society about why it is that men are more impacted than women by that plight? Why is there no campaign, the way we see feminist campaigns, kicked off to address that issue? I suspect it is in part because the media would ignore it, because they have been shamelessly pandering to the feminist movement, in my opinion. So actually this is why probably more extreme elements of the MLRA movement are being seen, because they not only, the thing is, feminists are resentful about misogyny, but they get a lot more airtime than men's rights activists get. And in my opinion, there are a lot of media outlets that basically bend to their demands. The BBC certainly does, and so does a lot of other major networks. CNN does, Time Magazine does, and there's almost no, this is not an exaggeration, there's almost no focus on male issues. So if it sometimes sounds like I am biased and I focus more on men's issues, the reason perhaps I do that is because I think that women's issues are already addressed, and they're already being widely debated and covered. And actually, I've got no problem with that. I love women, and I will absolutely endorse any campaign that is specifically about human rights for women. I'm not talking about phony campaigns that are basically going down the line of, oh, this is objectification. I'm talking about real human rights issues. I've no problem with those being raised, but I do have a problem with the fact that men's issues are callously ignored by the media, by all three major parties, and it's just plain wrong. So what this actually does is breeds resentment. So if there are more extreme elements of the MRA movement, then it's partly the fault of the media and the government and feminists for putting them into a corner and making these men angry and basically turning them into extremists. I guess it's the same argument that if a woman has had a terrible experience or she's been raped and then she turns into a man-hating feminist, you could explain her thinking because of her experience. Well, likewise, if a man has been treated like shit by the system, if he's denied access to his children, and if he sees that the media is completely ignoring the issues that are impacting him and hundreds, thousands of other men, of course he's going to be bitter and resentful. It's human nature. So I think there really, really needs to be a movement. And this is something I really want to work on, do my part, that really brings on issues that impact men and issues that impact women, and really make this a genuinely egalitarian movement. Because I'm convinced that both the feminist movement and increasingly the masculinist movement are basically just alienating people who might otherwise support them with some of the rhetoric that they're using. So just to be clear, I am not against all feminism, and I'm certainly not against all masculism, and I do believe that men's issues are not being addressed the way they should. However, that does not mean that I am going to endorse either movement. And everything I've said about feminism I stand by. Just to be clear, it's not individual feminists I'm attacking. I think I've met feminists individually, and I don't believe they're all bitter man-haters. I really don't think they are. But the movement has a lot of issues to address that is not going to be solved by its their current approach that it's taking. Masculism, I can understand the anger, but again, it risks alienating people who would otherwise be supporters. I mean, take for example women who would be sympathetic to some of those goals. It's stupid saying you hate women on a masculinist site, because there are women who are actually sympathetic to men's rights. All you're going to do is alienate them, so it's really stupid. If you want a progressive movement, you need to be inclusive. I think, and this is not a sweeping statement, I'm not saying that all MRA groups are like that. I've seen MRA groups that are responsible and who will be very inclusive, but there are also far too much there's too much rhetoric out there that is, I think, going to put off potential supporters. I suspect I'll be making more videos about gender issues because it comes up all the time, but I don't want people to think that I'm biased towards men either, because I am fully aware that there are many women's issues out there. I just believe that they are already being covered, whereas men's issues are not being covered as much. That's perhaps the only reason why I focus more on those issues. So thank you for listening to me. I've been talking for a while now. Thank you for your patience. And let me know your thoughts. So in conclusion, I just think the most progressive movement surely is a movement that looks at issues that impact both men and women. Feminism claims it does. It doesn't. It doesn't. Feminists do not actively show any interest in men's rights issues. So that is just disingenuous. Individual feminists may care. The movement doesn't give a shit. The masculinist movement, again, it's focused on men. And actually, I should say one last thing. It's not so much that I have a problem with a specific movement for men or for women, but neither movement should claim it is egalitarian if it's ignoring issues that are impacting the other gender, because that's just dishonest. I think it's time now for a third movement that really, really, genuinely focuses on both sides. If I was to promote this movement, and I'm not claiming to be the first to do so, but if I was to do my part in promoting such a movement, I would welcome moderate feminists and moderate masculists who agree with the general principles. But, people who hate half of humanity, or who promote double standards whilst claiming to be egalitarian, no, they shouldn't have any place in such a movement. And I really hope such a movement will get media focus and government focus, because it is about time that we all grow up and start really acknowledging that both men and women suffer. Now, until men's issues are started to be addressed more, I think the masculinist movement is going to be around for a long time. So the media and the government are partly to blame for that. I wish it didn't have to be that way, but I think for now it is inevitable.